Now that we have our classes made, we're going to get into events. And I'm making this its own video because there's a lot of settings and a lot of little nuances that can be tricky, but are good to know and will give you more flexibility when running your events. So when creating an event, you obviously want to give it a name. We're going to do summer heat and select the track. We only created one track earlier, so that's the only one that shows up. The start date and end time you will put in, and this is mainly cosmetic. You can always go back and change it. It does affect things like series. If you're doing multiple events in a series and you set the date range for the series to be X, Y, and Z, if this is outside of that, then it won't count that, but you can always go back and change it. And then the type is going to be qualify to main or best qualifier per class. And so qualifier to main means that you're going to have a qualifying round or many qualifying rounds, and that's going to put people into one final main event. And that can either be a bracket event or a letter main or a ladder main. But the point is you're qualifying people to move on to a main. The other option is best qualifier per class, and that is if you just want the results of the qualifier rounds to be the final results. So that would be more applicable to something like multi-GP qualifier, where you're doing just the qualifier rounds and there's no main that determines the outcome of the event. You're only doing it to get the results of the qualifying round. Most of the time for a normal race though, you're going to want to do qualify to main. And once you do that, you have the second column here that says, okay, how do you want to qualify people to the main? You're going to do results, top 2 consecutive, top 3 consecutive, top 5 average, which would be if people do 5 laps in a heat and averages those 5 laps. I would use that more if I thought people could do 5 laps, but 5 laps is usually kind of the ceiling for a lot of tracks these days, and so that wouldn't really be um, useful for us as much. You can also do fastest lap and then qual points and race points. You can hover over the question mark to see more detail about each of those. I'll only cover a couple here. Most of the time people use top 3 consecutive, so that's what we're going to go with. The best X number of qualifying rounds count. So most of the time people just say, hey, your top 3 consecutive for all of the rounds that you do. Well, you can also say, I want to do your top 3 consecutive for the best 2 rounds that you did. And so that's just another wrench that you can throw into things to mix it up. If you want to reward being more consistent versus just having one good round, you can do that. You can also do tiebreaker, which is only one option for. You can hover over and read the definition there. It's basically taking the person, if 2 people ended up with the exact same top 3 consecutive times, then it will take their result for how many laps they did and the amount of time as the tiebreaker. Down here you have the letter multi-main results. This does not apply to bracket mains, so that's an important thing to note. I just learned that myself. And this only applies to letter and just letter mains. And so, which we are going to get into a little bit for alternative to bracket racing. And then this last option down here is bracket last main results. And that's essentially asking if you want to do a single race at the end of your bracket, or if you want to do Chase the Ace or Chase the Ace without Ironman. And if you remember, Chase the Ace came about because we wanted to mix it up and be a little bit more exciting for national level events and just in general for spectators. Instead of having one kind of race that determines the result, you have multiple races at the very end. So that way you get to see the top 4 guys battle it out more than once, which a lot of people want to see. So that's the option. And then no Ironman and Ironman. Ironman is the default, and Ironman just means if you win all of your qualifying heats, or sorry, if you're your top qualifier and you win all of your bracket heats, that if you win that final race, then it's over. There's no Chase the Ace. So it kind of nullifies the Chase the Ace. If you choose the no Ironman option, then no matter what, the last race is going to be repeated until somebody wins twice. So again, you can hover over the question mark and kind of see the exact definition, but that's generally how it works. Pretty much everybody does chase the ace these days. Um, that's what we use, and it does make it a little more interesting. The points you really don't have to think about or look at. You know, it kind of looks complicated, um, and that's just because there's a lot of flexibility there. If you want to get into some crazy point situation for your main rounds, you can definitely do that. Um, and you can go crazy, give people bonuses for first place, and you know, all sorts of stuff. But the default section here is good enough. You don't need to change it. Um, just leave that be. You also don't need anything over here on the management side. That's usually for other types of events that LiveTime does. It doesn't really apply to FPV yet. Once you have everything set there, you just hit save, and now we're on the event screen. And so this is where we're going to get into a little bit more detail on how to configure everything in the event so that everything runs smoothly. So at first you'll notice everything is blank. We have to add the classes to the event that we want to use. And so again, it's kind of a carryover from the RC car racing world when they have 10, 15 different classes. They would choose which ones they want to do for the event and then what order they go in. For us, though, we usually only have one or two. And so in this case, we're going to have a 5-inch open class and then a 3-inch open class. And if you want to change the order, you can do that. And that's only helpful for things like heat sheets and stuff to tell LiveTime what order you want to run things in. The options for these are, you'll notice timing, rounds, audio, and splits. That should look somewhat familiar because we configured these timing options when we created the class. Audio and splits, I think, is also something you can configure beforehand. The only thing that we really need to focus on now is rounds. And under rounds, you have practice, seeding, qualifying, and main. Practice we use if you run actual practice rounds. If you're just going to run open practice, which you turn on and it doesn't actually track individual pilot times, it just tracks the channel. If you just plan on using that and not actually creating managed practice rounds, you can ignore practice tab as well. I typically do like to do just a couple practice rounds to make sure everything's working smoothly. And so what you can do is set everything up here. One thing to note is stagger versus heads up. Now, a lot of people are afraid of stagger. They don't know what it means. And essentially what stagger means is everybody is on their own clock. And so it's actually really useful for qualifying, which we'll get into in a minute. But everybody would start on their own clock when they go through the start-finish gate. Versus heads up, everybody starts when the buzzer goes off and you press start race. So that is a very important distinction, and we'll get into it a little bit more in the qualifying settings. For practice, though, I like to keep it heads up just to keep things moving along. When you do stagger, it can increase the round times. Since everybody's on their own clock, if somebody waits 10 seconds, that's 10 extra seconds you have to wait. So for practice, it's a good idea to keep it on heads up. These two options below aren't relevant for heads up. Transponders isn't relevant at all for any of the options. And then the forced start pilots and a staggered start, I'll get into in a second. Down here you have link settings, and so you're basically telling it, do you want it to be a race to the finish, or do you want to be a time and like laps in time kind of thing? And so practice and qualifying is almost always time. And so you're going to do the number of pilots that you want and then the length that you want to do. You can also set and limit it to a certain number of laps if you wanted. I haven't seen that done, I don't think, in FPV, but it is an option. If you say, hey, I want to only let people do 4 laps, you could definitely set that there. You can also allow a certain number of laps after the time expires. So don't get that confused with finish your lap. Finish your lap is the default without this checked. And so if the timer goes off, you will always get the chance to finish the lap that you're on by default. Now, if you click this, it's going to allow you to do 2 additional laps past that. And so that's popular in motocross, for example, where when the 20-minute main is done, they'll continue and do 2 additional laps after that. And so that is something to keep in mind. I have tried that before. I think I did like a minute and a half time and then let people do 2 extra laps. It doesn't really mean anything, or it didn't have a huge effect because most people can only do a certain number of laps in 2 minutes anyway. So adding 2 extra laps, even with a minute and a half, it didn't really do much. But it was an interesting thing to try, and you can always get creative with the formats you want to do. But we're going to leave that unchecked for now. Sort settings is going to be more about the racing screen, which we'll get into later. The seeding tab we don't really use in FPV. That's if you wanted to seed before qualifying. You could seed qualifying rounds, like heat sheets based on a seeding round. We don't really do that in FPV, so we'll skip over that. For qualifying though, since we are doing top 3 consecutive, I'm going to choose the stagger option here. And again, that basically means that everybody is on their own clock. And so I'll get into what exactly that means on the racing screen. It'll be easier to show you what that does. But essentially, everybody's clock will start when they go through the start-finish gate, not when you actually click start race. And so it's a very important distinction to know and for pilots to understand as well, that when the buzzer goes off at the end of the 2 minutes, that doesn't necessarily mean their time is up. That just means the initial 2 minutes is up. And so you really have to stress to pilots when you're doing stagger that their time is not up until LiveTime says they're done, is what I like to say. So it's very important to know and remember. With that, this option underneath is also very important. You don't want people to basically sit on the start blocks and wait until 1 minute 50 seconds and then take off and then have their own 2 minutes after that, right? After everybody's done. And so this option basically lets you force start everybody's time once somebody completes a lap. And so if you have a guy that's waiting on the start blocks and everybody else took off, it's going to start his time as soon as that first person comes around for their first lap. And so that keeps people from just waiting until everybody else has crashed or out and then taking off and then getting 2 minutes extra. So it's a very important setting to have and understand. For qualifying, we're still going to use time. That's what most everybody uses. We're still going to do 2 minutes. I'm not going to use the other options we talked about. Under main, we are going to do heads up here because you don't want people doing staggered start, because you do want people to, duke it out and, get the first to 3 laps or whatever. So heads up is going to be what you're going to use here. This option doesn't matter in that case, but we'll leave it checked. And down here, we're going to do laps. It's important that you do laps because in a main, you want to do first to 3 laps, for example. You could do time, but that's kind of not as exciting. You want people to do head-to-head racing in a main typically, and so that means you choose laps here. Sort settings again is more about the racing screen, which we'll get into later. And down here is where you set up the main. And this is what a lot of people don't quite understand, so I'll try to explain it. Bracket is going to be your most common. You can do single elimination or double. Double means you have to lose twice in order to get out. Single obviously means you lose once and you're out. So double adds a little bit of an exciting element where you have to keep competing in the losers bracket and try to fight your way back into the final races. So double elimination is what most people do. Then you have 2 options here, and you have to do a little bit of math in your head. If you want 16 people to race in your final, you're going to multiply these 2 numbers, and that's 16. So that's good, and that's what we need. If you want, 8 people, you'll do 4 number of initial races and 2 pilots per race. So what that would do would take the top 8, and one person would go to the winner's bracket, one person would go to the loser's bracket in that case. When you do 4, it's top 2 go to the winner's bracket, and bottom 2 go to the loser's bracket, and so on. One thing I found out recently is if you have like 17 people or 18 people, you can always still keep this here, and then it'll actually add those people to a couple of the races so that you can fit them in. So that way you don't have to do like a 24-person bracket when you only have 18 people and you want to include everybody. You can include those people in the initial set of races, and that just means that in a 5-person heat, 2 people would move on and 3 would not. So that's something to keep in mind, and I'll go over more when we get into the racing and creating mains and stuff. And then the last option here, just how many laps you want the main to be. Typically it's 2 or 3 laps. A good rule of thumb is you want it to be around a minute to a minute and a half of racing, and so you just take the kind of fastest guys laps and figure out how many laps that would need to make a minute to a minute and a half. And then once you're done with that, that's pretty much it. We're going to go to the other class here. The only difference we're going to do here is you still need to go through and set all these settings the same, which I'll do really quickly. We're going to do stagger, 6 number, and that's it for that. And then for main, again, we're going to do laps, and instead of a bracket there, we're going to do a letter main. And so if you don't know what a letter main is, it's just a different way of doing a main, which is more common in the RC racing world. And I wish I had a graphic or something to show you, but let's say you have 8 people, and actually 6 is a better example. You have 6 people, and which is what we had in our 3-inch class actually, so it worked out well. You can have A and a B main, and you can even, if you have like a ton of people, you can keep adding mains. But basically, this lets you have a race for those bottom 4 people, and then you save the top 2 people for the final race. And so, again, we have 6 people total. We're going to let those bottom 4 people race in the B main, and you can say I want them to race once, twice, or 3 times, and then for how many laps you want them to race for, and then how many people from that get bumped up. So you can have no people, or you can have 2 people that bump up, or whatever you want. In my case, I said, okay, I want these 4 people to race. I think we did a double race, and so it'll take the top 2 people that did the best in both of those races and bump 2 of them up to the A main. And so you'll see here I have 2 people initially, so that's going to be the top 1 and 2 people are going to be in that race by default. So they have to wait until the next 4 people get done, and then the result of that race adds 2 additional people to this race. That's something I didn't quite understand when I first set this up. And so we did an extra lap for the A main, and I believe we did double for that as well. And so again, the B main is going to be the bottom 4 people. And if you do the C main, it's going to be the bottom X number of people for that. That's another way to think about it. The A main is always going to be the top number of people that you select here. The B main is going to be the next number of pilots that you select here, and on and on. And when you do this, these people are going to race twice, and then the top 2 results combined from those 2 races are going to bump up into the A main, and then the A main heat is going to run twice, and then the winner of that is going to be the winner of the main overall. So it's a little confusing. I'll show you actually how it works when we get into some of the racing examples, and it'll probably make more sense. But yeah, that's it for the classes screen. Next, you're going to go to the seat screen, and for our 6-person race, we're going to do IMD 6C, which is pretty much standard for everybody. And you can add, individual channels if you want, or there are some defaults here. For DJI, you can add custom frequencies here to monitor, which is an important feature that not a lot of people know about. You can also set polarity there, and that's just useful for heat sheets. Camera position is something for the live streams that I'll also get into later. But for now, everything is default. Yeah, I think everything's good there. Registrations, this just lets you see how many pilots are registered, and you can create reports and things from that. Not using transponders or any of the other tabs really, except for timing results, which we'll get into later as well. But now we have everything configured for this event, and it'll allow us to run everything successfully without having to come back here and change these settings mid-race. In the next video, I'm going to cover adding pilots, generating schedules, open practice and all of that good stuff. This video is already pretty long, so I want to end it here. But if you have any questions, leave a comment below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can.